There are things a man knows that he will never say out loud, not because he is ashamed, but because no one would believe him. And there are things a man says out loud that no one believes, not because they are false, but because believing them would require accepting something about the world that the world has agreed not to accept. A doctor told me once over champagne in Florence while the evening light came off the Arno. He was very precise about it. He remembered everything. The story is called Told for the Truth. It was written by Cyril Hume in 1927. Make of it what you will. Good evening, and welcome to Hitchcock's Tales That Terrified, Episode 13. Cyril Hume was a Hollywood screenwriter. If you know Forbidden Planet, the 1956 science fiction film, Shakespeare's Tempest transplanted to deep space, one of the foundational films of the genre, you know Cyril Hume's work. He also wrote Tarzan films. He was a craftsman who understood structure, economy, and how much to withhold. Tonight's story was written in 1927, when Hume was 27 years old and still writing fiction rather than screenplays. Alfred Hitchcock collected it for this anthology for a reason. The title is Told for the Truth. It is told by a doctor to a stranger over champagne in Florence. It concerns his old friend Hunter and Hunter's wife, a dark, vital, magnetic girl from an old Georgia family. And it concerns what the doctor did one evening when he arrived at the house to find it quiet and dark. The doctor will tell you everything. He will be very precise about it. Whether you believe him is entirely your own business. This is Tales That Terrified. Let's begin. This story was told to me a year or two ago by an American doctor from Philadelphia. I met him in the American Express at Florence, and because I knew the city better than he, I was able to render him a slight service. As a result, he had me to dine with him. We became acquainted over champagne. He was a pleasant, blondish man with thinning hair and a look of out-of-doors healthiness. He annoyed me a little at first. His smile was perhaps too charming. I could see him using it at bedsides of his more fashionable lady patients. But over the second bottle of champagne he seemed a good fellow. For a while the doctor told me many curious facts concerning the grim tricks nature plays with human flesh. He spoke quietly. I was reminded of an old biology instructor of mine who had used the same manners over my student microscope. Strange things, all of them strange. Some so strange that there are only 2 or 3 examples of them in the books. You'd think doctors would run into cases like that, wouldn't you? But there seemed to be a sort of shame attached to them. They're kept hidden. Undertakers must come across amazing examples. I tell you, it's a shock when one does run into a case, a completion and a fulfillment of what is only indicated by those rudimentary cases in the books. Then I found myself listening to his story. It never occurred to me until later that he was a liar. This friend of mine, may as well call him Hunter, had been a kid with me. We lived next door for years in a suburb of Philadelphia. He and I went through the pet animal stage together. There was a disused shed on this place where we used to keep out our menagerie of mice and turtles and rabbits and stray cats. I suppose that at one time or another we must have had 20 creatures in our crates and cages. Of course, there was nothing strange in that. All boys reached the pet-keeping stage. The strange thing was that Hunter never graduated from it. I went on to long trousers and cigarettes and girls, but Hunter stuck to his animal. After I broke up the partnership, he began collecting snakes. Knots of them he had under glass. Then there was a big screen cage full of all kinds of spiders that used to devour each other. Finally, someone gave him a fox puppy. That was the time I nearly quit my girl chasing to join him again. Hunter stuck. I don't remember ever seeing him even look at a girl. But cats would go to him in a way that would scare you. You mustn't think that there was anything queer about Hunter, though. except that his eyes used to go happy and soft whenever he saw an animal. At college, his room whiffed of them. It was full of squeaks and scurries and whistles. He'd spend an evening with you, though, any time, and he'd let you name your bar. It was Hunter, for instance, who stole the safe out of the dean's office in junior year. There was nothing in any way queer about Hunter. Until he got himself a lemur. You know, one of those weaselly, monkeyish little creatures with a thick, furry tail as long as itself. Hunter carried the thing everywhere with him. It would sit on his shoulder and wrap its tail around his throat and cling to his scalp with its nasty, half-human hands. A wise little foxy face with big shining eyes that peered at you and seemed to wonder and try to think. But all those years, Hunter never had a girl. You can imagine then how surprised I was doing my last year at Bellevue, when I got a letter from Hunter asking me to come down to Philadelphia to meet his fiancée. In his letter, he tried to describe the girl to me, but all I could gather from his incoherencies was that she was from Georgia, and he loved her crazily. He said, "But you know how these woman haters are once a woman gets a hold of them." I could not get off to Philadelphia at once, but by the time I did go, I was worried. I had heard things. You know, the vague, insinuating stories one hears sometimes. A person laughs when they're told. They seem to go in one ear and out the other. One can't even remember who told them, but they leave cobwebs, rotten stories. Nothing actually against the girl. She was supposed to be right enough. As a matter of fact, she was a member of one of the oldest families in the South, the kind of family that's so old it has bona fide pre-revolutionary history, and queer fables besides. These stories hinted rather than picturesquely at a vast, uncultivated estate in Georgia with not a single black person on it. It seemed they refused to stay there, and for generations all the servants in the great house had been Finns. A race of warlocks, the Finns, silent people. Then there was an even wilder yam about the girl's brother. He was supposed to be a great mathematician and chess player whom no one ever saw. He was kept locked up in a little shuttered brick library which was detached from the main house. Now and then, at night, he'd break out, and there'd be trouble among the horses until the Finns captured him again. Neighbors told stories of the Finns whooping through the night with flashlights and ropes, and a naked running man whose monstrously long forearms ended in globes of bandage big as a man's head. Gossip, of course, but the stories were queer. Suppose it was even simple insanity. I worried a great deal when I finally on my way to Philadelphia. I can't say just what I thought the girl would be, but I'm quite certain that in the back of my mind I was sure she'd be strange and unwholesome in some way. I probably expected to be repelled by her, so that when I met her the surprise was like a blow in the face. Not that she was not strange enough and unwholesome enough, too. But where I had looked for repulsiveness, I found only danger. The sort of danger that fascinates a man and challenges him, and unless he is wonderfully self-controlled or very fortunate, makes a slave of him. I looked at her with a kind of horror, and, do you know, the first thing I said to myself was, "Good God, I've got to be loyal to old Hunter." She was a slender, tall girl, very dark and vividly colored, but in spite of her height, she had the quick appearing grace of a little woman. She had thoughtful and unreadable brown eyes. Her small head was covered with dark, childishly fine hair, which fell naturally into waves that somehow gave the impression of life and instability like the photographed waves of running water. Perhaps I did not notice all these things in the moment when we were introduced. I could not have, of course. However, I'm certain I felt the resultant force of them. But in that first instance I felt another force besides which had nothing at all to do with outward appearances. The force of her personality. The soul, if you prefer to call it that. Yes, when I met poor Hunter's fiancée, I'm sure I discerned something of her soul. And what I discerned chilled me with a kind of gothic fear, for it seemed to me that her soul was entirely body. Perhaps I'm not clear. For example, certain thoroughbred animals, fine horses or fine dogs, are so beautiful and alive, so proudly conscious of their own beauty and vitality that something radiates out from them. Something that many humans lack, something one feels and must venerate, an emanation, a soul. That was Hunter's lovely, passionate-lipped young fiancée. We shook hands. She looked steadily at me and said, "How do you do?" in a charming southern voice which did not quite deep enough rightly to be called contralto. Those are the only words I can remember her ever having said to me. We must have spoken together 100 times after that, but I can actually remember only her first words. I stood holding her strange, unwomanly hand, and I thought, God help me. For in that moment I was whirled away on a wind of longing and desire so overwhelming that even then I wondered at it. In that moment, too, I had carried her off to a fury and a consummation of dream-perfect love-making. I vividly pictured the time when I should look down bewilderedly close into her eyes and see them as every man must long to see the eyes of a woman he loves, with the underlid drawn upward at the corners in an expression almost of fierceness, with the upper lid drooping so heavily in a passive drunkenness as to be pitiful, and between the eyes themselves luminous, deep, and soulless as the open eyes of a cataleptic. You see, I fell in love with the girl, all in an instant as I held her hand. And so I said, God help me, I must be loyal. But even as I said that, I was disloyal, for I looked at her and longed for her. I can imagine no woman being quite as unconscious of the flood of emotion which poured out of me toward her just then. At such moments a woman knows. She takes her hand away more quickly or more slowly than usual. She does this or that with her eyes, and she has answered you. But this quiet southern girl made no sign whatsoever. Her eyes remained steady and thoughtful. Her long, unwomanly hand neither hurried nor lingered. She felt nothing. I asked myself how had gentle, simple old Hunter ever seized upon and held this girl, this dark flame more terrible than an army with banners. And I knew it had been the lemur. Don't ask me how I knew, or why, but I'm certain I was right. The lemur entirely deserted Hunter for the girl now, and I think Hunter was jealous. He would call, Chicky, Chicky, and clap his hands, but the little animal that had been so obedient would only turn its face and look when Hunter called. It would cling tighter than ever to the girl, and the girl would smile. Hunter hated it, and I hated it. Chicky would perch on the girl's shoulder and curl his long tail close about her neck in a kind of embrace, or it would sweep the thing over her body as if it appraised her, softly, gropingly, tenderly, and she would smile. I hated it. But I must go back and tell you of the evening when I met her first. There was to be a small dinner. As Hunter's best friend, I was to sit next to his fiancée. Hunter genially told us to get acquainted. That was the purpose of the dinner. After my first stunning surge of desire for the girl, I managed to get myself a little in hand so that I was able to notice various things about her. She was stranger even than I had imagined she would be. This was back in 1920. You remember the clothes girls were wearing then? Short, knee-length affairs? Well, the first thing that surprised me about Hunter's fiancée was that her skirt reached to her ankles, and when I looked close, I guessed that her gown had been made at home. I don't mean to give the impression the girl looked shoddy. As a matter of fact, the thing she was wearing seemed to me very lovely. It was made of some soft, flesh-colored stuff, and there were silvery strips in the skirt. It clung about her with more amplitude than was the fashion then, and long folds of inevitable grace. She made a striking, and to me, an exquisite contrast to the rest of the woman in the room. As I watched her, I noticed with the tender and indulgent amusement of a man in love that she was extraordinarily careful of her Greek-like draperies, more careful even than a woman is likely to be. Careful with the meticulousness of a Persian cat. When she sat down or rose to her feet, she arranged her skirt about herself almost with anxiety. It struck me at the time that in spite of her care, its grace was marred now and then by an awkward gathering or a heavy fold. Dinner was announced, and I followed her into the dining room with my eyes focused upon the nape of her slim neck. And I thought how I'd kiss her neck just there where my eyes rested, and how I would encircle her throat with my kisses like a chain to bind her to me. Then I had a shock. My eyes jumped to keener focus. Below the sharp line where her bobbed hair ended, I could see, in spite of the powder that had been laid on it so artfully, that the skin was faintly blue with subcutaneous hairs like the shaved chin of a dark man. This bluish sheen, which only the closest scrutiny such as a lover's could detect, ran out of sight below the rather high neck of her dinner gown. My mind put a fantastic and sickening question, so that for a moment I felt a bitter antagonism for this tall girl who walked so gracefully and so pliantly before me into the bright dining room. But when I held her chair for her at the dinner table, I forgot my resentment. I could only watch with an almost painful tenderness how childishly careful she was in arranging her long skirt. I might have been drunk for all I can remember of that dinner. None of its conversation comes back, and only a few of the faces that ring the table. I can recall vaguely that all the women seemed constrained, and that I said to myself, I'm imagining all this because she is so much more alive than they. Perfume came from her, more disturbing than any I'd ever known. I remember watching her hands. They were thin, lovely hands. The nails were longer, more pointed, and more highly polished than I suppose was quite good taste. But at the time my heart was bursting to kiss them. They were not a woman's hands. She did not use them as women use them, to supplement her beauty. When they were idle, they lay in her lap or rested on the table edge, unaffected and relaxed as resting animals. What was most unusual, she was not, as is every newly engaged girl, even absently conscious of her blazing solitaire. When she stretched her hand out, I saw the ring had slipped around on her finger and the stone was turned in. She seemed unaware of this and left it so. Strong hands. Once she took an almond in one of them and removed the shell with motions so deft and quick I could not see how she had done it. Afterwards, she seemed confused. I sat beside her in a trance-like abstraction. At the head of the table sat Hunter's mother, a largely beautiful, turned-out woman with the sort of personality that heads ladies' committees, and the sort of hair that is compared to platinum. Even in my abstraction, I saw that she was tense like the rest of us, the rest of the women at the table, and that she seemed worried. These things are vague. I may have imagined them. A girl was sitting beside Hunter directly across the table from me. She was a pretty girl with a cloud of golden hair and a patrician air. One could tell from her manner that her people must be socially prominent in Philadelphia. A fine, courageous child, innocently arrogant, proud because of inexperience, assured because of her looks and her position. I watched her mistily, and if I recall, almost regretfully, as a man might look back from fairyland into the dear, ordinary world of unenchantment. And somehow I felt sorry for the child, and somewhat grateful too. Soon I was aware that an antagonism had sprung to life between her and the dark woman beside me. Their eyes came to grips across the table. All the while, aloofly, wistfully, carelessly, I was admiring the fine, unbroken arrogance of the girl opposite me. The woman at my side betrayed no arrogance, no heat. She was simply quiet and altogether attentive. All at once the girl across the table began to blush, painfully, conspicuously. Her blue eyes fell, as though they had looked inadvertently at something shameful. For a while she struggled with a confusion which brought her close to tears. When she had mastered it, she gave her attention to Hunter with a force and frightened vivacity. Next, I realized that the woman beside me had become jealous, furiously jealous of Hunter and the girl next to him. Now there was no possible reason for this. His face was dull and vacuous with adoration. But surely I felt emanating from this woman so intense a current of jealous hatred that I was frightened of her, and stabbed with admiration. I watched out of the corners of my eyes, experiencing fear, desire, awe. Suddenly I felt a strong, muffled blow on my calf, as though some hurrying animal had gotten entangled in a woman's dress and had blundered against me. A moment later, the same thing again, so strong this time that I started and looked down. Miss Hunter's eyes must have been on us all through dinner, for she caught my start and called at once, "What is it, doctor?" I answered stupidly something about imagining that Cheeky had run across my leg. Miss Hunter told one of the servants to see if Cheeky had escaped from the sun porch, and then came back shortly to reply that the creature was asleep in its basket. Everyone laughed, Hunter's fiancée with the rest. Well, when a new topic of conversation had distracted the other guests, she turned her head quick as an animal and gave me a look of fury that made me a little sick with terror. In an instant her face was calm again, and I might have thought I had imagined her look, but that she moved slightly in her chair and sat further from me during the rest of the dinner. I remember Miss Hunter's eyes at the end of the table. Her face was the face of an assured, skilled hostess. but her eyes were puzzled and worried. Love for the girl took me irresistibly. After less than 5 hours in her presence, I found myself loving her with an intensity which I had not imagined possible. I knew nothing about her. I had no especial sympathy or respect for her. In fact, some instinct warned me that if I see her once uncloaked in clamor, I should find her hateful and repulsive. And yet I felt for her an almost insane tenderness, a more than insane hunger. She preoccupied me so completely that I was not even ashamed of making no attempt to combat my infatuation for her, the fiancée of a friend. I became a monomaniac, ruthless with desperation. After that first evening I began following her. I tried deliberately to make her see, to make her feel the thing that shook me. If I remember, I actually tried to speak of it once or twice. Hunter was quite blind to all this. In his infatuation with her, he was as preoccupied as I was. But she herself understood me very well. I had no doubt of that. And I felt a demonic exultation that her understanding failed to trouble or to anger her. I sensed a conscienceless evil in her, and my heart cried out to it. But except for this fact that she knew my mind and still tolerated me, she did nothing during those weeks to which even Hunter and his worried mother could take exception. Hunter and she were married shortly. I was best man. The memory of the pain I suffered that day affects me still with a faint nausea. To me, everything that happened was like the slow, formless ceremonial of a fever. I was desperate, crazy, with a degrading and vivid physical jealousy. There were impulses in me towards violence and homicide. He took her away finally. I watched her little feet mount briskly into a waiting limousine, and through a silver haze I seemed to notice an ugly fold at the back of her skirt. Then she was gone. One thought alone kept me from running amuck among the guests. When they come back, I said, I shall be invited to the house very often. My whole nature closed upon that thought like dull snake jaws over a stone. They returned from their honeymoon sooner than had been expected, and I had a telephone call from Hunter almost immediately. He asked me to lunch with him at his club on the following day. I went to the appointment speculating indifferently whether or not I should stab him where he sat at the table. But when I saw him, there was something in his look which jumped my heart with a fear that everything was not well with his wife. It is hard to describe that look. I have seen it often, and I had had to steel myself against it in the hospital corridors where women wait in mortal terror and mortal pain outside closed doors, afraid to put in a speech the question their eyes are shrieking. Hunter seemed older now, littler, utterly subdued. His naive good nature had shriveled, like a fruit that rots without having ripened into pain. I asked him quickly if his wife was well, and he assured me that she was very well indeed. But his manners only strengthened my sick misgivings. I went to their house for the first time, weak with the fear that I should find her ill. Then I saw her, and literally I was stunned by the blaze of vitality that seemed to spread out from her dark, sword-like rays. It was as though all her hidden energy of living had been realized at last, and released somehow to drench a world of lovers. And in that first instance when I saw her, I had an intuition strong as a conviction that it was because she was to have a child. I sat in her presence, adoring her and desiring her beauty, crying out silently in exultation to the living evil of her soul. Presently I glanced at Hunter and was struck to wild eternal laughter. The idiot was treating this woman, this flaring nebula of energy, as though she was an invalid. Her voice and all his gestures were soft. He kept trying to make her comfortable with cushions and footstools. She, I thought, who might sit naked upon a throne of iron to be adored forever. His eyes were sad and tender like those woman eyes in hospital corridors. His mouth was wistful, gentle, and effably sad with smiles. She resented this tenderness, and repaid him with such fierce scorn that I could have shouted for pride in her. He would come close and bend over her and whisper anxiously, but she would turn away her dark head, which seemed to me to be always crowned with rays. The lemur on her shoulder would show its little teeth and chatter angrily. I suppose you will despise me. I suppose I ought to despise myself for my behavior. Yet, in retrospect, I cannot blame myself any more than I could blame another person, one of my patients, perhaps, who was suffering from some fever or brain disease. And actually, all the events of those days are vague in my memory as the recollections of a sickness. I would come to the house of my old friend, sometimes as often as 3 times a week, with the definite intention of seducing his wife. When my last year of internship at Bellevue was over, I moved to Philadelphia immediately so that I could be near her and see her every day. For the three of us used to sit around in the evening after dinner talking together. As I remember those evenings now, it seemed as though there must always have been two conversations going on simultaneously. For the life of me, I can't be certain. But either we talk aloud, all three of us, or of casual things, while Hunter's wife and I addressed each other telepathically without words. I told you I can remember nothing she ever said. Or else she and I had those amazing conversations aloud, while Hunter sat by. Okay, next page. In silence, apathetic because of what he knew. Whether I actually spoke out or not, there's no doubt but that she understood. She would sit impassive, smiling a little and denying me. Again, sometimes she would seem to withdraw into herself as into an immense silence, and brood there over some secret thing which I knew was the child she was to bear. And every day the aura of her vitality grew in size and intensity. As she sat, the lemur would perch upon her or scramble over her. Occasionally it would scold at Hunter. Hunter would watch his wife, and his face was very tender and very sad. One day Hunter came to me and said that he was worried about his wife, that he had been worried for some time. He thought that I might, considering the fortunate circumstance that I came to the house as often as a friend, take the opportunity of observing her professionally quite without her knowledge. I accepted quickly. Hunter thanked me. Had I noticed anything peculiar about her lately? I answered as calmly as I could that to me she seemed to be in exceptionally good health. But Hunter shook his head and looked harassed. It was not so much her bodily health he was speaking of, he said. He thought there was something of another sort wrong with her. But he would let me observe for myself. For he was worried. He was certain there was something in her mind which was dragging her apart, slowly away from the normal thoughts and motives of human beings. This, he admitted, might be due to a certain physical misfortune of hers. But no matter about that just now. It was her mind only that concerned him. She had become subject to odd and increasing fits of excitement during which she seemed, when it almost seemed to him, that she was regressing towards something he didn't care to think about. Then there was this physical misfortune. Perhaps that. But he wanted me to see if I could reach the trouble through her mind before he spoke of that. I made nothing of this rigmarole. In my excitement, I hardly paid any attention to it. After that, I came to the house, even more than often than before. And when I was alone with Hunter, I would pretend seriously to discuss his wife's condition with him. I wouldn't worry, I'd say. It's nothing serious, I'm sure. Still, I'll watch. I have a notion, too, that I'm beginning to get at the trouble you mentioned. Just a little time. But in the meanwhile, there's really no need of worrying. And Hunter would be grateful. So, more and more, I continued to implore her, speaking madly and obscenely out of my unbalanced brain. And she sat impassive, always refusing me, beautiful, underdraped in occasionally awkward clothes, terrible and compelling with the radiance of her vital force. She would only listen, saying no words that I could remember, smiling a little, and with her long, inhuman hands caressing the agile, clinging body of the lemur. And from week to week, her invisible field of power expanded and grew in strength until I thought it must crack and explode presently, like an overcharged cloud, into destroying lightning. Hunter watched in deep sadness. For myself, I could only hold my breath and adore and wait almost in fear. Sometimes it seemed to me that the lemur waited also. I became filled with a kind of wincing expectancy during those last days. I have no idea what I expected. Anything, I suppose, which would relieve the constant increasing tension. And my expectation produced in me that feeling of nervous expiration one gets from watching a long cigar ash and wait for it to fall. As I said, I felt that the lemur was waiting too, waiting with more knowledge and more certainty than I. But that final afternoon I had no premonition, no idea at all. It had been a slightly overcast day late in March. I came to the house as usual shortly after 5 o'clock, expecting a talk and a cocktail or two before dinner. Now night was falling. There was a faint gleam of ugly color in the west, and it seemed as though a thin yellow glow clung in the upper branches of the bare trees along the street. I reached the house at twilight. As I climbed the front porch, I was surprised to see no lights in any of the windows, and to hear no noise at all in the recesses of the house. The place was still and shadowy as the reckless excitement, as though it had been empty for a decade. I listened with God knows what thoughts tearing through my mind. Then presently it seemed that after all there was a sound, high overhead inside the house. A squeaky creak, I thought, regular as the beat of a pendulum, but so faint I could not be sure I was really hearing it. I listened, with my hands poised irresolutely over the doorbell. Then, for no particular reason, I began remembering my own expectations of disaster, and wondered. Hunter has been so bothered, I mused. Could there have been a reason after all? Then something said to me, there are no servants in this quiet house. They have left as they have always left. Sometimes I thought I heard that thin sound high under the house roof. Sometimes not. But in the intervals of doubt my memory kept time, and presently I would pick up the rhythm again, and I peered through the glass of the front door. But there was a net curtain inside, and I could distinguish nothing. As I peered, the silence of the house poured out to me, burdened faintly with that indefinable creaking which beat like a metronome above it. All at once I knew I must ring the bell without delay, or else turn away in the twilight from that door and run with fear under the bare trees. Suddenly, hysterically, I shot my thumb against the bell button and held it there. Then, as suddenly, I drew back my hand in panic. Deep in the house, the frightful clangor of the bell had summoned fear up from silence. Silence fell back, but that awakened fear came near to me and crowded close behind the door. And now it seemed as though that squeaking sound beat faster because of the fear, just as my own heart beat. I heard feet fight, gallop down the stair inside. Behind the curtain I saw a dim motion, a blob of shadow that darted and bounded here and there, swift as a frightened captive bird. Then, startlingly close against my eyes, Cheeky's face appeared upon the curtain. He clung for a moment, looking out at me with bright inscrutability. Then he was gone again, and I could see his moving shadow and hear him dashing softly about in the hall beyond the door. There was something unbearable in the reckless excitement of the small creature, loose and alone in the still house. I thought I'd be sick if it continued, so I tried the latch. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and entered. "Cheeky!" I called in a queer voice. "Cheeky! Be still!" The lemur sprang up to the top of the newel post and perched there with his long tail hanging. He sat quite still, looking with shining, excited eyes alternating at me and towards the top of the shadowed stair. As though he beckoned, I advanced across the hall. Cheeky leaped down from his perch and ran swiftly on all fours before me up the stair, carrying his tail high like a cat hurrying to be fed. I followed silent. As I climbed, I heard, now unmistakably, that faint creak which beat on and on above the dark hush of the house. As I reached the landing of the second floor, I saw Cheeky scuttle down the hall and flash into the doorway of the room I knew to be Hunter's. Hunter's body lay twisted upon the bed. His face was towards the ceiling. It shone like silver in the dusk, except where a dark stain ran down from one corner of his mouth to form a small black fan upon the pillow. My nose stung with the faint reek of an acid, and when I searched, I found an empty bottle on the floor. I went close and touched Hunter's hand. It was cold. I said, "Oh, Hunter." Then Cheeky on the footboard of the bed began chattering very loudly. "Quiet," I whispered. "Cheeky." Cheeky commenced chattering again, and again I whispered, "Quiet." For a little longer I stood listening to that thin, regular sound above my head. My pulse shook with it. Hunter's big golf bag stood in one corner of the room. Hardly thinking what I did, I went over to it and chose a heavy niblick with a stout shaft. Gripping this, I went out into the hall. Cheeky followed. I was certain now where the sound came from. I crept towards the attic stair. Once I stumbled and looked down, I saw one of her long dresses lying in a heap at my feet. Further on were a slipper and a stocking. The sound was very plain now, a heavy, muffled creak such as wood might give out. Complaining under some uneasy weight. Clutching the niblick, I moved forward. It was almost dark in the attic. I blinked and peered. Then Cheeky chattered, and I heard the answer. Looking upward, I saw that shadow swinging from the roof beams, and I understood. I shall not tell you, because you could not believe how she was swinging there, making the beam creak rhythmically under her weight. But I shall tell you that she hung head downward, and that she chattered as the lemur also chattered. I think I did not move for a long time after I saw her, because it had become quite dark in the attic when the thought came which cut through my terror with a flash of anger. The thought of the child she would bring into the world. My fingers tightened upon the niblick handle. Afterwards, I came down from the attic and rummaged among poor Hunter's shaving things in the bathroom. Then, with the candle and the instrument I had sought, I climbed the stairs again. Considerably later, I stumbled down through the darkness into the cellar of the house. I moved uncertainly because there was no light, and my hands were occupied so I could not feel my way. The weather had been mild, so that the furnace was checked when I found it. The whole thing took some time, especially as I was careful to make no noise when I put on more coal. But at last it was over. I opened all the draughts and went upstairs again. I arranged Hunter's shaving things as I had found them. I removed certain spots from the attic floor. Then I telephoned the police. The coroner who investigated the case decided that Hunter had taken his wife to the attic and beaten her in her skull with the heavy golf club which was discovered near the body, and that he had then immediately gone down to his room and drunk a pint of corrosive cleaning fluid. The coroner offered no theory concerning a motive for the crime. A friend who had discovered the double tragedy had testified that as far as he knew, the Hunters had been happy together. Insanity at once suggested itself, though an autopsy revealed no lesions in Hunter's brain. The coroner had no doubts as to the actual facts of the case, a murder followed by suicide, though certain aspects of it puzzled him. First, the body of Hunter's pet lemur had been found in the upper hallway with its neck wrung. Second, although the weather was mild, the furnace had been burning furiously when the police arrived at the house. One of the officers had investigated this suspicious circumstance by dumping and investigating the fire, and had discovered among the embers what appeared to be the oxidized and scattered backbone of some unidentified vertebrae. Third, when he examined Miss Hunter's body, he had discovered a skillfully made incision at the base of the spine. My companion rose suddenly. "I guess I've drunk too much," he muttered. He picked up his hat and wandered away across the square. It did not occur to me until later that the man was an outrageous liar. Told for the Truth by Cyril Hume, 1927. The doctor described everything with great precision. The coroner found the furnace burning. He found the bones. He found the incision. Whether the doctor is telling the truth is a question Hume never answers. A jealous man who killed his friend's wife in a rage might construct precisely that kind of a story. Or he might be telling you exactly what happened in that attic and letting you decide whether you can accept it. Hunter watched his wife with sad and tender eyes all through the story. He knew, whatever she was, he knew, and he loved her anyway. And in the end, it destroyed him. That is a very old story. Cyril Hume went on to write Forbidden Planet. He understood monsters. This has been Hitchcock's Tales That Terrified, Episode 13. Like, comment, subscribe. Been Felix Lubezki. And I think I can get it put up. There it is. What is our next story? Our next story, folks, is looks like Side Bet by Will F. Jenkins. Side Bet, Will F. Jenkins. So expect that soon, folks. But anyway, like I said, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. Good night.